Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And as you can see, today's topic is the modern civil rights movements. Now, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, why, be able to connect them to each other and their larger historical significance. You got it? Let's get started. Guys, strap in, because this is going to be a lecture. So if you thought those cracks in the conformity consensus were growing to this point, and they were, post-Brown, they're going to continue to rupture, explode into large chasms. And for Anglo-America, this was the protests of the modern civil rights movements. Now, I know the term is generally civil rights movement. I know. But I am purposely making it plural here. Because as we shall see, the civil rights movement was far more than just Dr. King. It was far more than just a fight for African American civil rights. The African American movement itself was not monolithic, as well as other groups that would push for inclusion, meaning that it truly is movements. So let's talk about the jump starts to these movements. But please keep in mind, these pushes for inclusion in civil rights do not begin in the 1950s. They've been at work for decades. It was just the post-World War II and post-Brown decision that we find some of the more high-profile pushes and the willingness of the government to at least not get in the way. Now, one of the biggest things about the modern civil rights movements was the use of new media means and increased technology to spread the message to a larger audience and to get popular opinion on the side of the protesters. You see, television and newspapers were integral in convincing the average, everyday Anglo-American to join their side or at least support their cause. Because television and radio, or television and newspapers were able to lay naked the brutality of racism that existed in America. You see, most Anglos knew there was a problem, but it was kind of like out of sight, out of mind. As long as it wasn't in my backyard, they could ignore it. But the media coverage, the positive portrayal of protesters, in other words, that they were the ones being attacked, could show just how bad things really were and to what lengths the Anglos would go to prevent people of color from achieving inclusion and equality. So the power of public perception will be embraced by both African Americans and Mexicanos in the fight for inclusion. Now, I am going to briefly cover some of the major events of the African American civil rights movement, because this is what's most often better known to students, and it offers a good transition to the Mexican American civil rights movement. And so, of course, one of the most famous events for the African American civil rights movement was, of course, the Montgomery Bus Boycotts, as being one of the jump starts of sorts for the civil rights movement. Now, of course, very famously, Rosa Parks, she would be arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus. Now, please note, there are some very common misconceptions about her. She was not a random victim of Alabama racism. She was chosen. She was trained for this. She had married an NAACP member named Raymond Parks in 1932. She had been involved in the NAACP in Montgomery, Alabama since at least 1943. She was elected the executive secretary of the president of the chapter. In other words, she had long been working within the civil rights movement and civil rights activists. Now, the arrest, of course, took place in 1955 on December 1st, as Rosa Parks got off work one night around 6 p.m. and sitting in the seat directly behind the white section, because the white section was currently full, 4 white passengers entered. The driver demanded that 4 African Americans give up their seats to the 4 whites that came on. Rosa Parks merely moved over to the window seat, but would not move further back in the bus. When the driver threatened to call the police if she continued to refuse, she very famously responded, "You may do that." She would be arrested, charged, and convicted of disorderly conduct for failing to follow a city ordinance. She would appeal the decision, which begins the formal process of challenging the legality of segregation. Again, this is all being done post-Brown, using the court system to challenge the legality of segregation laws. Now, Parks says that the reason she failed to move was because she was tired. And people have often kind of portrayed her as this old, poor woman, just exhausted. But later she clarifies this in her autobiography, saying, quote, "People always say I didn't give up my seat because I was tired. But that is not true. I was not tired physically, or at least no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. I was not old, although some people have an image of me being old at that point. I was 42. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in," unquote. Again, she was not the first Black woman to refuse to give up her seat. But the NAACP had been trying to coordinate an effort to challenge the segregation laws in Alabama on buses. And Rosa Parks became the perfect victim because she had a clean record, she had a high school diploma, and she had been involved in activism for years. So she was not just some random person, she was chosen. Challenging segregation entailed knowingly breaking the law, getting arrested, and then fighting in the court system. Using the judiciary branch to challenge or enforce civil rights was a staple of civil rights activism in the 50s and early 60s. Of course, the story goes on. The night after she was arrested, Black community leaders met at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church to organize a massive bus boycott under the organization called the Montgomery Improvement Association. The pastor of that church was a 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. This was kind of the beginning of his civil rights career that will catapult him to the top of civil rights leadership. Dr. King had studied nonviolent civil disobedience tactics of Gandhi and wanted to bring those tactics to the civil rights movement. He said that we must use the weapons of love. We must realize that so many people are taught to hate us, that they are not totally responsible for their hate, and that we will soon wear you down by our capacity to suffer. And in winning our freedom, we will so appeal to your heart and conscience that we will win you in the process. Now, this is very idealistic indeed, but very focused on educating white racist Southerners, winning their hearts and minds through disciplined, nonviolent civil disobedience. These are the roots of the early civil rights movement and its underlying strategy. The idea was, oh yeah, we'll get beaten, we'll get pummeled, we'll be hated and reviled, but we will do it peacefully. And when that makes the news on television, with video and news, in newspapers, the headlines will be showing the brutality of white people and draw sympathy for the protesters. Back to the bus boycott. The NAACP, along with King leading the charge, wanted to hit the Anglo population where it hurt, the pocketbook, economically. So the bus boycott achieved remarkable solidarity in Montgomery's Black community. For months, African Americans formed carpools, they hitchhiked, or simply walked, refusing to take the bus. The cost to the bus company was quite a lot of money, but the white city government officials held out through the boycott. Finally, the boycotters won a federal case against bus segregation. In 1956, the Supreme Court decision let it stand. Another blow to segregation. The overall effect was crippling to the Montgomery bus system because the Black population that was boycotting this transit system was the vast majority of the patrons. Now, historians are often guilty of oversimplifying the civil rights movement by focusing on Dr. King when it comes to this integrationist phase of the civil rights movement. But realize Dr. King was not alone. Aside from him, a major flashpoint of the civil rights movement for African Americans occurred in 1960, 5 years after the bus boycott. Black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, inspired by the ideas of nonviolent civil disobedience, would launch a mass movement by demanding service at a whites-only Woolworth lunch counter. So this is a place you go in to get lunch, like a diner. And the lunch counter served whites only. If you want to sit there, you had to be white. And all they simply did was walk in, sit down, and peacefully demand to be served. Again, technically illegal. It is disobedience to the framework of the laws, but it's very passive and nonviolent. Within a week, the so-called sit-in movement had spread to 6 more towns in the state. And within 2 months, it had spread to 54 cities across 9 states. They took insane amounts of abuse. They were heckled. They were struck with clubs, poked with cattle prods, dumped hot coffee over their heads, burning them. But they sat stoically, taking the abuse. This was nonviolent civil disobedience. Out of the sit-in movement also came a new civil rights group known as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. They were referred to as the shock troops of the revolution. 3,600 white and black activists in this youth movement would spend time in jail for civil disobedience. They were pelted with rocks, burned with cigarettes, and subjected to unending verbal abuse. This is the kind of the youth movement of the civil rights movement for African Americans. And then in 1965, another civil rights organization, the Congress of Racial Equality, wanted to challenge the federal court ruling that had banned segregation on buses and trains and in terminals. And so what they did was send white and black activists onto buses to ride into the South, to challenge local laws on segregation, such as separate waiting rooms at the bus stations and train stations. These were known as the Freedom Rides. In Alabama, white mobs would attack the travelers with pipes and fists, and one of the buses was burned. The first 2 Freedom Rides will end after 12 days, with bus drivers refusing to drive, and with Alabama Governor John Patterson refusing to protect them. But they would organize a second Freedom Ride from Nashville. This time, the Freedom Riders were attacked in Montgomery, Alabama. Martial law was declared. President John F. Kennedy and Alabama John Patterson would send in the National Guard to move the Freedom Riders from Alabama to Mississippi. Once they reached Mississippi, the governor there would not allow violence. He simply arrested them and sent them to Parchman State Penitentiary. The same governor who once said that the Negro is different because God made him different to punish him. The new battle cry for Mississippi was not about enduring violence, but rather fill the jails. Freedom Riders from all over the country would stream into the Deep South, riding into Mississippi, getting arrested immediately. All told, more than 430 people would be arrested, 300 sent to Parchman State Penitentiary. And finally, Attorney General Robert Kennedy would call on the Interstate Commerce Commission to officially remove segregation at all bus stations. This becomes the first unambiguous victory of the civil rights activist movement. It created a whole new generation of activists, both white and black. And it inspired other groups to be more bold. So now let's turn to Mexican Americans. Remember, their fight does not start in the late 50s. the movement just accelerated in the 1950s. And be sure, there was going to be an enormous backlash against these civil rights activists. So, quick recap. To combat segregation and racism as the GIs returned home to a nation that continued to disenfranchise, segregate, and discriminate versus Mexican Americans, they had to confront the racism head on. And during the 1950s and 60s, they began to demand for equality and civil rights. And following the Supreme Court victories, a new kind of activism would emerge and lead to a new kind of activists. Yes, those two civil rights groups are still around. LULAC, still around, still fighting to destroy segregation. They launched numerous Supreme Court cases aimed at ending segregation and poverty and disenfranchisement. They also launched several initiatives to make up ground in education, including starting what was called Little Schools of 400. It was a new preschool program formed and developed by LULAC and run by Felix Tijerina. Tijerina had studied the problem and concluded that lack of English skills prevented children from passing in first and second grade, ultimately forcing them to fall behind and drop out of school. If, he believed, you could teach preschool children English before they enter the first grade, their chances for succeeding would drastically improve. So Tijerina met with state leaders, including the governor, Price Daniel in Texas, to discuss the problem. A pilot education program was proposed but not funded. LULAC also failed to come up with the money, but Tijerina provided it. The pilot education program was established in the summer of 1957 in Ganado, Texas. It was designed to teach Spanish-speaking school-age children 400 basic English words prior to their entry into public schools, so they could more easily manage the classroom. The goal was to prevent the tracking of these students, the retention or holding back of these students, or the assigning of these students remedial or special education classes due to a limited language proficiency. The first year was so successful that all the students who came out of the Little School of 400 program passed the first grade. And the next summer, the program was expanded to 9 more cities. It also included the Head Start program, a program that will become a blueprint for what we know today as a federal government program. And the government itself would adopt the program in the 1960s and make it available to every school district throughout the nation. Also still active was the American GI Forum, still around, still fighting to destroy segregation. Remember, the original purpose was to secure equal rights for Latino vets, protesting racial discrimination against veterans. They launched a campaign we talked about last time to expose the segregated practices regarding mortuaries and cemeteries. They also initiated anti-discrimination lawsuits and voter registration campaigns to increase Latinos voting. But by the 50s, the chapters would also expand throughout the nation and would include not only non-vets and women, but would also implement loan programs for housing and scholarships for higher education. And then this becomes very vital by providing loans for people to buy homes. Again, to get out of those barrios and impoverished ghettos. By providing higher education scholarships, they're able to help educate a new generation of Mexican Americans. But of course, the real nationwide coverage for Mexican Americans begins with the Farm Workers of California. Now, the United Farm Workers, or the UFW, 1962. This becomes the largest Mexican American union in the United States, dedicated to protecting the rights of field workers. Started in the fields of California, and while it will largely be Mexicano, please note that it was a coalition of both Filipino and Mexicano workers that in the fields often struggled to come together. It was co-founded by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, who had briefly worked as an elementary school teacher. Huerta saw that her students, many of them children of farm workers, were living in poverty without enough food to eat or other basic necessities. Many would be forced to drop out of school to work in the fields to help out their families. And so to help, Huerta became one of the founders of the Stockton, California chapter of the CSO, the Community Service Organization, that worked to improve the social and economic conditions of farm workers and to fight discrimination. And then in 1962, she would go on to be a co-founder of the United Farm Workers Union, alongside, of course, Cesar Chavez. Now, a quick word about Chavez. I know, especially in recent years, there are a number of students, a number of Mexicanos, who have issues with Chavez. Indeed, parts of his life can be quite problematic. He was very against undocumented immigrants. And this is a problem, an issue that needs to be discussed when discussing Chavez. But realize also that he's trying to lead a strike of farm workers in California, and that agribusiness, the landowners are using undocumented immigrants as scab laborers brought in to break the strikers, undermining his cause. Again, most of these workers didn't even know they were being used as pawns, but it definitely influenced how Chavez viewed them. In addition, again, this is problematic. I'm not saying it's not. In addition, later in his life, something that's not very well known about him, he actually formed a commune or a compound that was eerily similar to a cult, to where people went and lived and didn't really leave. Now, it never did not end in tragedy ultimately, but it was a cult-like atmosphere where he was kind of the cult of personality in charge. And again, these are very fair criticisms of Cesar Chavez. And those are things that can still be discussed and acknowledged, while still acknowledging the vital role that he, along with Huerta, will play in helping farm workers. So, that aside, in 1962, they together will form the UFW, and they begin to call for a strike. Now, when these strikes took place, the workers were subjected to physical and verbal attacks throughout their peaceful demonstrations. And what they realized very quickly was that the basic idea of strikes in farm labor didn't work as well. And so, in order to gain more media attention, in order to use television newspapers more effectively, they, in 1965, began a nationwide protest in the form of a boycott. So the idea was, we will not buy their product on a nationwide scale. And in doing so, we will hit them in the pocketbook, very similar to the bus boycott in Alabama. And they specifically targeted one corporation, the DiGiorgio Corporation, who made grapes and wine. And so the idea was they focused on one grower and focused on hurting them in the pocketbook. They wanted to be very targeted in this. And to bring national media coverage, they started this nationwide grape boycott. They set up picket lines outside grocery stores to inform people and educate people about the plights of Mexicano workers. Now, to bring national media attention to this, in 1966, they would embark on a pilgrimage wherein they would march. Huerta, Chavez, and the UFW would set out with 100 farm workers to walk from Delano, California to Sacramento, the capital, about 300 miles. After 25 days, they would swell from hundreds to a group of thousands. This would bring national media attention, expose the plights of farm workers. And it caused the movement to spread to places like Texas. In 1966, the UFW would lead a march from the Rio Grande Valley to Austin to protest farm worker exploitation. In all cases, though, this was nonviolent protest. Chavez, Huerta, the UFW, would become the face of nonviolent protest. And again, once again, be inspired by the methods of Gandhi. For instance, in 1968, Chavez would begin a 25-day fast. Now, in case you don't know, a fast is usually a religious thing where you choose to abstain from food and any kind of drink other than water. And it's very famously done in the Bible, of course, many times. And Chavez undergoes this food strike, essentially, for 25 days in 1968. And he will begin this 25-day fast in penitence for farm workers' moral problems. He talks about the violence. And remember, he's a very staunch Catholic. There's a strong Catholic influence here, talking about penitence and moral issues. He only ends the fast when 4,000 people come together and plead with him to do so before he dies. Among them, Attorney General Bobby Kennedy, who at this point was going to be campaigning for the presidency. But these boycotts were not just about workers in Texas and California. The boycotts extended across the country and even internationally. They would help to forge a later Mexicano coalition that connected residents in places like Michigan and New York to Mexicanos in California and Texas. For example, in Michigan, where Cesar Chavez would go numerous times, Michigan was very active in the Great Boycotts. Michigan educator Emily Martinez recalled how even though the Michigan farm workers were not organized, but they still participated in the Great Boycott. Also, despite having a good job at Buick, a member of the UAW, Apolonio Zamarripa, would help rally Mexicanos in Flint and educate everyone else about why the boycott existed. It was said that from 1965, when the first cries of huelga echoed in the San Joaquin Valley, to 1968, when the strike moved to the Midwest, support for La Causa never wavered. His children, Zamarripa's children, recalled him picketing several area grocery stores, attending meetings and rallies, passing out literature, wearing his huelga buttons proudly as a constant and uneasy challenge to others that their cooperation and support was greatly needed. He would take his children with him and have them on the picket lines passing out literature and shouting, "Huelga, huelga," alongside their father. When the boycott changed from grapes to lettuce, Apolonio Zamarripa still went out to picket and continued to give financially to La Causa. The spread of the boycotts to places like Michigan would inspire a new generation of activists. For instance, the UFW movement was one of the major impetuses that launched a young Maria Guadiana into activism. Now, she credits her propensity for activism to growing up in her father's involvement of Detroit's El Círculo Mutualista. But Guadiana really began to get involved that on the day that Thomas Gonzalez of the Catholic Workers Organization knocked on her door asking if she wanted to help organize the UFW Great Boycott in Detroit. She then would go out to California and work at Ground Zero. It was this experience that would lead her to come back to Detroit and start a Brown Beret chapter. More on this later. She helped to organize a group known as Latinos en Marcha, an initiative to boost college attendance among Detroit Latinos, and for her to push for public school education reform that would help install the first Latino principal in Detroit, Michigan. These community activists were vital, but so were everyday people. In the end, the UFW would help defeat the giant agricultural firms and force them to pay their workers livable wages and provide benefits. The year was 1966. And though after a few years, it would start to see receding wages once again due to a lack of federal legislation and enforcement. Remember, farm workers did not have the Wagner Act that industry did. But the UFW and the methods of Chavez and Huerta would, like for African American bus boycott, inspire an explosion of civil rights organizations for Mexican Americans across the nation, including Maria Guadiana. But also, some others would start the political association of Spanish-speaking organizations known as PASO. This was a political organization in Crystal City, Texas, founded by Mexican Americans that would unite to take over the city council in that city. It became an umbrella organization designed to politically mobilize Latinos and increase the number of registered voters and voter turnouts. It focused on minimum wages, welfare measures for the poor, educational reforms. It reflected a sense of growing political muscle and clout. And it would be integral into the next phase of the Chicano movement in the later 60s and 70s. Yes, the movement would turn more radical, but that's a topic for next time. So until then, take care and bye-bye.